Katia Daniels is a 40-year-old woman whose life is a delicate balancing act between managing the Pike County Group Home for Negro boys and navigating her personal struggles. A deeply empathetic and tenacious individual, Katia dedicates herself to ensuring that the boys in her care, most of whom have faced unfathomable abuse and neglect, receive the opportunities they deserve. However, her mission is constantly thwarted by institutional barriers, societal prejudice, and the ghosts of her own past. Katia's mornings often begin with a jarring reminder of her burdens. Haunted by nightmares of her twin brothers who fought and died in Vietnam, she awakens with a sense of heaviness that only deepens as the day unfolds. Her father's old Chevy truck, a symbol of her family's faded legacy, sputters to life reluctantly each morning, much like Katia herself, bracing for another battle at the group home. The group home operates out of a grand, yet deteriorating, antebellum mansion once owned by Confederate Colonel Samuel P. Arrington. Katia sees the irony in this. The former seat of white supremacy now serves as a refuge for black boys cast aside by society. She has transformed it into more than a shelter, it is a place of healing and hope. The boys are taught to aspire, to dream, and to break free from the cycles of poverty and despair that brought them here. Yet, her vision is met with resistance from powerful forces. Samuel P. Arrington IV, the new president of the Home's board, embodies the old guard's regressive mentality. Unlike his late father, Big Sam, who supported Katia's progressive initiatives, Samuel IV is a staunch opponent of her approach. He insists that the boys be prepared for trade jobs rather than pursuing higher education or other ambitious goals. His condescension and veiled threats challenge Katia at every turn, making her fight for funding and approval an uphill battle. Her lone ally on the board is Mrs. Adelaide Hendricks, an elderly woman with a sharp wit and a deep understanding of the boys' struggles. However, Adelaide plans to step down soon, leaving Katia feeling isolated in her fight to maintain the group home's mission. Even some of the black members of the board advocate for lowering expectations for the boys, fearing that aiming too high will lead to inevitable disappointment. Katia refuses to succumb to this defeatist mindset, determined to prove that her boys are capable of greatness. The day's challenges come into sharp focus when Katia arrives at the group home and is greeted by Pee-wee, a precocious 9-year-old who urgently informs her of a crisis. Chad, a 14-year-old boy with a troubled past, has cornered his caseworker, Mrs. Gates, and assistant director Jason in the family room. Armed with a chair, Chad is enraged by the suggestion that he should return to live with his drug-addicted mother, Lena. Chad's outburst is deeply rooted in his traumatic past. Lena, who has repeatedly chosen her addiction over her son, allowed her boyfriend to assault Chad, leaving him scarred both physically and emotionally. Despite this, Mrs. Gates, new to the group home, recklessly broaches the subject of Chad returning to his mother, violating Katia's explicit rule that no caseworker speaks to the boys about their placements without her approval. Katia steps into the tense situation with a calm authority that commands attention. Her afro, a proud declaration of her identity, seems to radiate strength as she approaches Chad. She speaks to him with a mix of firmness and compassion, acknowledging his anger but guiding him toward a solution. Her mantra, "When we are calm, we can make change happen," resonates with Chad, who eventually lowers the chair and agrees to a truce. Katia then facilitates a moment of reflection, helping Chad understand the consequences of his actions while affirming his right to feel upset. She emphasizes that anger can be powerful when channeled productively. Once the immediate crisis is resolved, Katia turns her attention to her staff. She reprimands Jason and her secretary, Leslie, for failing to inform her about the situation sooner. While she recognizes their good intentions, she stresses the importance of following protocol to protect both the boys and the staff. Mistakes in judgment, however small, can have devastating consequences in an environment as volatile as the group home. Later, in her office, Katia prepares to confront Mrs. Gates. Her frustration is palpable. Mrs. Gates' lack of sensitivity and understanding has jeopardized the fragile trust Katia works tirelessly to build with the boys. Yet, Katia knows that anger alone won't solve the systemic issues at play. Her role demands diplomacy, even when her patience wears thin. As she steels herself for the conversation, Katia reflects on the weight of her responsibilities. The boys' pain is her pain, their victories, however small, are her victories too. She sees herself in their struggles, having grown up in a society that often dismissed her potential. Her unwavering dedication stems not only from her professional commitment but from a deeply personal desire to break the cycles of oppression and neglect that trap so many young black boys. Amidst the chaos, Katia finds solace in the little things: the blues music that plays softly on her office radio, the warmth of Pee-wee's laughter, and the rare but genuine moments of connection with the boys. These glimpses of hope fuel her determination to keep fighting, even when the odds are stacked against her. By the end of the day, Katia knows that her battles are far from over. The board meeting next week will likely bring new challenges, and Samuel Ivy's opposition shows no signs of waning. Yet, Katia remains resolute. For her, the fight is not just about the boys in her care but about changing the narrative for generations to come. She carries the weight of her ancestors' struggles and her brothers' sacrifices, channeling their strength into her work. Katia Daniels is a force to be reckoned with, a woman unafraid to stand alone in her convictions, willing to face adversity head-on for the sake of the boys who depend on her. Her journey is a testament to the power of resilience, compassion, and unwavering belief in the potential of those society deems unworthy. As she locks up the group home for the night and climbs into her old truck, Katia allows herself a moment of quiet reflection. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but she is ready. After all, the boys are counting on her, and Katia Daniels never backs down. Miss Daniels, a dedicated leader of a group home for at-risk boys, finds herself in a heated confrontation with Mrs. Gates, a rigid caseworker from the Department of Human Services. Mrs. Gates arrives unannounced at the group home early in the morning, clearly intent on taking Chad Montgomery, one of the boys under Miss Daniels' care, back to his mother, Lena Montgomery. Miss Daniels, weary yet unwavering, immediately identifies the situation as one of the countless systemic battles she fights daily to protect her boys. Mrs. Gates insists that Lena, having completed a 3-month rehab program and attending AW meetings, is now ready to reclaim custody of her son. She presents the legal paperwork signed by Judge Smith to validate her authority. However, Miss Daniels pushes back firmly, pointing out the inadequacy of such minimal effort to prove Lena's readiness for motherhood. She reminds Mrs. Gates of Lena's repeated history of relapse and the trauma Chad has endured every time he's returned to her. This cycle, Miss Daniels argues, is not just negligence, it's torture for Chad, who has finally found stability and peace in the group home. Miss Daniels, already exasperated by Mrs. Gates' high-handed demeanor and lack of concern for Chad's safety, refuses to accept the caseworker's dismissive attitude. She demands that the case be brought before a judge in a formal court setting, where all sides can present evidence and ensure a proper investigation into Lena's fitness as a parent. Mrs. Gates, reciting policies and legal statutes, argues that the law prioritizes reuniting children with their parents and that it is her duty to facilitate this without resistance. Miss Daniels counters with her unwavering belief that children belong in safe spaces, and her priority is to protect Chad, even if it means standing against Mrs. Gates and the broader foster care system. Throughout the conversation, Miss Daniels exposes the inherent biases and failures of the child welfare system. She notes how boys like Chad, particularly black boys, are often treated as expendable or collateral damage by an overburdened system more concerned with following rules than truly protecting vulnerable children. Miss Daniels doesn't shy away from pointing out that if Chad were white, the caseworker's approach would likely be different, meticulous and cautious, with a greater emphasis on his safety and future. Mrs. Gates, growing increasingly frustrated, attempts to assert her authority by threatening to call the police or forcibly remove Chad, given the legal documents authorizing his transfer. Miss Daniels remains resolute, refusing to be intimidated. She accuses the system of prioritizing convenience and protocol over genuine care, stating that neither Mrs. Gates' needs nor the needs of the foster care system will ever outweigh the well-being of her boys. Her commitment to Chad's safety is absolute, and she vows not to surrender him without a fight. The conversation reaches a boiling point when Mrs. Gates insists that time is of the essence and that the law provides no guarantees of safety. Miss Daniels, however, refuses to accept this justification. She reiterates her demand for a court hearing, determined to ensure that Chad's case is given the attention it deserves. Mrs. Gates' fiery response, asserting her authority and the inevitability of Lena regaining custody, falls flat against Miss Daniels' calm yet unyielding demeanor. Miss Daniels' resolve highlights her role as a protector and advocate for the boys in her care. Her ability to navigate systemic obstacles, despite the emotional toll, underscores her dedication to providing stability and safety for children society often overlooks. In Chad's case, her fight represents more than a disagreement with Mrs. Gates. It's a battle against a flawed system that frequently fails the very children it claims to protect. By the end of the confrontation, Miss Daniels has not only stood her ground but also reframed the narrative. She makes it clear that while Mrs. Gates may see Chad as another case to close, she sees him as a young life worth fighting for. Miss Daniels' insistence on accountability, fairness, and Chad's well-being challenges the complacency of the system, setting the stage for a larger reckoning. Despite Mrs. Gates' threats and bureaucratic authority, Miss Daniels remains steadfast, determined to ensure that Chad's future is decided with care, thoughtfulness, and justice.